The hedgerow fighting in Normandy is not war, it is systematic murder. The Allied planners had prepared for every inch of the invasion beaches. They had studied the coastlines for months, memorizing every mine, every bunker, every gun emplacement. The beaches of Normandy were dissected in aerial photographs and intelligence reports. Yet, for all their preparation, no one warned them about what lay beyond the beaches, the bocage. These were not mere hedges as one might find in an English countryside. They were ancient walls, centuries old, built by forgotten farmers whose hands shaped the land long before gunpowder was even invented. Stone foundations layered and packed with centuries of earth, crowned with hawthorn, bramble, and oak trees, whose roots clawed down as deep as crypts. Some of these barriers rose 15 feet high, old as the Crusades, unyielding and eternal. And there were thousands upon thousands of them, spreading across Normandy like the veins of a nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant William Arendt of the 29th Infantry Division would later write in his journal, "Hedgerow fighting is the toughest in the world, with the possible exception of close-contact jungle warfare." His words were not exaggeration. The German defenders had turned every field into a fortress. Each stretch of earth between hedgerows became a kill zone. Machine gun nests hid behind dense foliage, pre-sighted mortars zeroed in on every possible approach, and anti-tank guns waited in the shadows of tree lines, patient as wolves. The tactic was simple and deadly. They allowed the Sherman tanks to climb the hedgerows, exposing their vulnerable bellies, and then, with one well-placed shot, they turned steel and flesh into smoke. Another tank crew silenced, another patch of soil baptized in fire. The standard Allied tactic was a rhythm of blood and exhaustion. Infantry advanced across open ground under withering fire. Engineers crawled forward, planting explosives to blow a gap in the hedgerow. Then tanks rolled through the opening if the Germans had not already fixed their sights on it. And once the gap was taken, the process began again in the next field. Every stretch of earth, every wall, demanded the same sacrifice. Each field consumed 30 minutes. Some took an hour. Some demanded the lives of 10 men, 20 men, a tank crew, and sometimes even the medic who tried to drag them to safety. At this pace, the liberation of France would not take weeks. It would take years. General Omar Bradley stood in his command tent at night, pacing with restless fury. Cigarette smoke filled the air like fog, curling above the maps that littered his table. Those maps were supposed to show the way forward, yet they were lies. They showed neat lines, roads, and towns, but they hid the truth. They did not show the maze of living green walls that was tearing his army apart. His divisions were bleeding out in a countryside that looked harmless from the sky. Bradley knew that for every hedgerow conquered, there would be another waiting beyond, silent and lethal. The casualty reports arrived every morning, typed in perfect columns: name, rank, serial number. Each paper sheet represented another platoon of boys who would never return home. Some had survived the beaches of Omaha and Utah, only to die in a farmer's field that hadn't changed since the Middle Ages. The engineers worked desperately, experimenting with anything that might give them an edge. The 79th Infantry Division tested a crude hedge cutter, a set of welded blades mounted on the front of a Sherman. The 19th Corps tried using shaped charges and prongs. The 5th Corps tried brush cutters and green dozers. But nothing worked fast enough. Every attempt brought minutes of advantage at the cost of hours of labour and lives. It was as though the land itself had chosen a side and it was not theirs. The fields of Normandy were not open battlefields. They were traps, green cathedrals of death, enclosed by walls that turned every advance into a funeral march. American soldiers learned to fear the quiet between fights more than the firefight itself. In the stillness, the air carried only the buzz of insects and the whisper of leaves, yet death could erupt at any second from behind a hedgerow. The enemy did not need to move. They simply waited, invisible and efficient, turning patience into their greatest weapon. Each platoon learned quickly that bravery alone would not save them. They crawled through ditches filled with mud and broken helmets, trying to outthink an enemy they could not see. Some soldiers began to name the fields they captured the Devil's Garden, the Green Hell, the Orchard of Blood. It gave them something human to cling to in the middle of insanity. Yet for every name written on a map, dozens of names vanished from the roster. The fields were eating men faster than any general could replace them. By late June, the Allied command knew they were trapped in a grind. The beachhead was secure, but the breakout, the dream of sweeping through France, had turned into a nightmare of attrition. Bradley's staff officers calculated that at the current rate, every mile gained was costing hundreds of casualties. The infantrymen began calling the campaign the meat grinder. It was not a metaphor, it was their reality. Men were being fed into a machine that gave nothing back but more bodies. Tanks burned, men screamed, and still the hedgerows stood, untouched, ancient, and defiant. Letters from home spoke of victory parades, of hope, of pride. But on the ground there was only mud, fear, and the metallic taste of blood. A young private from the 30th Division wrote in his diary, "We move forward by inches. Each inch has a name and a price. Sometimes I think France will drown in the blood we're spilling for it." His diary was found later, in the ruins of a farmhouse, the last page unfinished. The German defenders had perfected their art. They fought from concealed positions, firing short bursts and disappearing. They had memorized the terrain, they didn't need maps. To them, every hedgerow was an ally. They used the thick roots for cover, tunneled through them like foxes, and popped up where no one expected. Snipers perched in the trees above, hidden by leaves, waiting for a glint of a helmet or the faint movement of a rifle barrel. Mortars bracketed the lanes of advance so perfectly that some officers swore the Germans could see through the earth itself. And behind them, the roads to Saint-Lô and Caen turned into graveyards of burned-out armour and shattered trucks. Commanders demanded solutions, but innovation in the middle of slaughter came slowly. In the field workshops, mechanics and welders worked under shell fire, experimenting with scraps of steel, pipes, and saw blades, hoping to invent anything that could help the tanks punch through the hedgerows. It was desperate, chaotic ingenuity, born from despair. They were not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting time, terrain, and exhaustion. Meanwhile, the rain came. Normandy's weather turned the earth into a swamp. Boots sank deep, trucks bogged down, and wounded men lay half buried in mud. The smell of rotting vegetation mixed with the stench of death. Every night, the sound of distant artillery rolled through the fog, echoing like thunder from another world. And in that haze, the soldiers of the Allied divisions began to realize the grim truth: liberation was not a single battle or a shining victory. It was a slow, grinding, endless struggle, fought hedge by hedge, field by field, breath by breath. By early July, morale began to fracture. Officers tried to keep spirits high, promising that the next push would break through. But the men knew better. They had seen what waited behind each wall. They had learned that every time they advanced, someone they knew would not be coming back. Still, they moved forward. Because that was the only direction they could go. Forward into another hedgerow. Forward into another storm of bullets. Forward into another day of the meat grinder. And yet, in the middle of all that horror, small acts of courage lit the darkness. A medic dragging a wounded comrade through gunfire. A tank driver refusing to abandon his burning vehicle. A platoon leader charging a machine gun nest with nothing but a rifle and fury. These fragments of bravery, scattered like stars across the nightmare, reminded them of why they were there: to push on, to endure, to survive. The bocage was ancient, but the men who faced it were determined. Though each field felt like the end of the world, each victory, no matter how small, was a step toward breaking the German hold on France. The walls might have been built to last 1,000 years, but so was the resolve of the men trying to tear them down. And as the smoke of battle drifted through the Normandy fields, one truth became clear. The meat grinder would not last forever. Someone, somewhere, would find a way to beat the hedgerows. But until that day, the fields of Normandy would keep claiming their due, one field, one life, one heartbeat at a time. July 2nd evening behind the lines, Cullen's crew sat in a tight circle passing a dented canteen of liberated Calvados around like contraband and shared a brittle kind of comfort. The apple brandy burned down their throats and left a slow heat that distracted from the thinking about tomorrow's advance into the bocage. Coulin stared at the men and at the wrecks of tanks in the nearby field and felt the tightness that comes when planning feels helpless. "Problem is the hedgerows," Corporal Roberts had said earlier, and the words hung there because they were the blunt truth. These walls were not hedges, but ancient earthen banks topped with hawthorn and oak, whose roots braided like the graves. Every field was a new piece of medieval architecture, and the Germans had turned each into a fortress with pre-sighted mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank positions. The standard tactic with engineers and explosives and tanks climbing over the lip was working at a terrible cost. Men and crews were being consumed in rhythms, measured in names on casualty lists and in burned steel that would never roll again. Coulin had been thinking of leverage and momentum, of how a tank could be kept low and level instead of rearing when it struck a wall. Roberts had spoken of wild hogs and of tusks that tore through roots, and the image lodged in Cullen's mind like a splinter. What if a tank had tusks? The corporal had half joked, and then said with a seriousness that surprised them all, "Steel prongs welded to the crest, front like teeth." The idea was at once ridiculous and brilliant, and in the hush they could hear the sound of something possible being born. Davis shook his head and asked where they would get the steel, and someone pointed toward the beaches where German obstacles and hedgehogs and wreckage lay in heaps. They moved at night with wire cutters and ropes, and the kind of furtive purpose men use when they are stealing time back from war. Welders made a run of sparks under a tarpaulin while the moon slid behind clouds, and boots dragged metal through mud and lanes no longer friendly. They shaped prongs and braces from scavenged crossbars and plates, and bolted them to frames with battered rivets and a practicality that felt like prayer. The first mount was crudely beautiful, a forked assembly angled to bite and pull rather than to lift and expose the tender belly of the hull. They balanced the fork to keep the tank level and added a torsion brace to absorb the shock, so the mount might not shear off on first contact. The crew tested in a mended lot of fields, starting slow and steady, aiming to meet the hedgerow at a pace that would let the teeth find purchase. On the first attempt, the Sherman did not rear. It did not expose its belly. It sank the prongs in, and with grinding noise and tearing root, the hedgerow began to yield. The field opened, and for a moment, a breath went through the men as if the earth had exhaled with them. Engineers and mechanics iterated quickly because the battlefield is a harsh teacher, and improvement saves lives fast. A latticed plate was added to catch debris, and a curved leading edge helped to deflect branches and shrapnel away from vulnerable mounts. Other crews copied the idea and modified it. Some welded heavier blades, others added diagonal plates, and someone bolted a mesh guard to protect the hull. Names stuck to the device: tusks, the rhino mount, the hedgerow cutter, depending on who told the story and where they stood in the line. Word reached battalion command, and the first reaction was paperwork and the threat of reprimand and the language of regulations. Practicality, however, is a patient negotiator when lives and equipment are on the line, and commanders softened once they saw fewer burned tanks and fewer men added to the lists. The improvised cutter did not solve the war, but it altered the tempo of slaughter and allowed infantry to advance with fewer pauses for salvage crews and funerals. That night, around the dented canteen, the men felt something like relief and pride. which is a different shape than the triumph the propaganda promised. Roberts, who had spoken the hog story, sat back with mud on his boots and a grin that would not leave his face. Cullen watched them and felt a heavy kind of pride settle like an anchor in his chest. They all knew that command might later demand justification and paperwork, but for the hour they had altered the odds inside the small theatre where they lived. The hedgerows would not cease to be brutal, nor would German defenders stop using them. But the rhythm of the grind was changing. Where a field had taken hours or cost dozens, it could be taken in far less time, and the reduction in losses was not abstract. It was measured in men who kept breathing into the night. Mechanics and welders who had once hastily repaired tracks and patched radios found time to tinker, and the front line became a laboratory of necessity. Improvements came from trial, error, and the blunt suggestions of those who lived closest to the machine and the earth. A sergeant wrote a recommendation that read like a confession, and commanders filed it under practicality, and a small sheet of paper moved through an office and did not return, marked with denial. Rumours of court-martial waned as tales of fewer burned-out hulks multiplied, and people prefer results to rigid doctrine when the body count stops climbing. In the days that followed, crews became bolder, and the dynamic of assault shifted with each improvised mount that met a green wall and bit like an animal. The hedgerow cutter did not make war humane, but it gave men a chance to cross a field without the same slow tally of loss they had once accepted as inevitable. Small victories compounded, and maps that once felt like traps began to show routes that were more plausible, and movement felt like mercy. In the weeks that followed, the improvised cutter became part of the vernacular of the front, and was copied and adapted up and down the line. Stories of bold drivers and stubborn mechanics spread in letters and in whispered reports, and the object became a symbol of pragmatic ingenuity. There were critics who insisted the change was minor and that luck and logistics mattered far more, but the men at the hedgerows measured success in steps forward and in names not added to lists. Men did not stop grieving for comrades, and the hedgerows continued to take their due, yet the new tool offered a seam of hope in a place, made of loss. The tale of the tusks spread beyond the platoon to workshops and to other units, and each copy bore the fingerprints of those who had made it. It is easy to romanticize battlefield invention and to call heroes of necessity, but the truth lies in the quiet stubbornness of those who refuse to accept needless death. Cullen and Roberts and the welders were not mythic. They were practical, they were angry, and they were tired, and their invention was born of those moods. The war would continue with more hard mornings and more fields that resisted, but on that July 2nd evening, a spark was struck that would change the cadence of many small fights, and the canteen went around the circle, and the brandy tasted like something earned, and the men slept with a wary hope that their crude invention might save more brothers from the hedgerows. July 3rd to 13th, 1944. The night shift became a secret life for Sergeant Cullen and his crew, and what they chose to do in the dark was undeniably illegal. At midnight on the first night, they stole a supply truck, headlights off, and drove to Omaha Beach under a sky that hid them like an accomplice. The beach had become a graveyard of steel since the invasion. Thousands of German obstacles and Czech hedgehogs, crosses of heavy I-beams planted to tear the hulls from landing craft, still jutted from the sand and surf. The Navy and engineers had other priorities, and the pieces of enemy iron lay abandoned to the tide. There was no paperwork that would authorize their taking and no officer to sign the requisition, but there was a pile of metal that could be turned into something that might save lives. Using hacksaws, blowtorches, and brute force, they cut sections of beam free. The steel was thick and salt roasted from the sea, heavy enough that 3 hedgehogs filled the bed of the truck and left the tailgate sagging. If anyone had stopped them, there was no sensible explanation. They were thieves in uniform, and they knew it. Nobody stopped them, perhaps because no one expected men on foot to haul antiquated monsters of iron into the night. Back at a barn behind the lines, they set up a makeshift workshop beneath a tarpaulin, lamps shielded against the sky, and for 10 nights, while the company slept, they became clandestine mechanics. Cullen was not a trained welder. He had been a liquor salesman before the war, and learned fixes by doing, but necessity is a stern teacher. He and his men cut the I-beams into prongs, each one 4 feet long, and shaped mounting brackets from scavenged plates. They argued about angles and leverage, and how to keep a tank from rearing when it met a hedgerow. Roberts kept saying it needed to bite low like a wild hog and pull upward, and the image stuck. Welds were ugly and shaky at first, sparks flying like angry fireflies under the tarpaulin, but the idea took form. A set of heavy steel tusks welded to the front of the tank, braced with torsion supports and stiffeners to absorb shock, a curved leading edge to glance aside roots and brambles, latticed plates to keep debris from the crew, and diagonal braces to prevent shear at the mount points. They tested fits against fence posts and old carts, made shims and diagrams in grease pencil, and argued late into the night over the proper curvature that would keep the hull level instead of letting the nose climb. The work was ugly and practical and born of rage at a landscape that had cost them friends. On the 13th night, with no authority but all the risk already assumed, they bolted the final assemblies to Cullen's Sherman. The device was heavy and absurd. 4 heavy steel prongs jutting like tusks from the hull, angled low to bite and pull and hold the tank level as it met the green walls. Some men called it the fork, others the rhino, and someone laughed that it looked like a beast with a broken snout. Davis said, "If it works, you are a genius." Cullen said, "If it does not work, I am caught, marshalled," and the room filled with a silence that had in it both humour and the knowledge that they had crossed a line. The first test they chose with care, a wet field and a hedgerow that had already taken men and a Sherman when it reared and flung its belly into a German sightline. They drove slow, aiming to meet the wall at a pace that would let the prongs find purchase. When the fork met the earth, there was a ripping that sounded as if something old and stubborn was finally being torn aside. The Sherman did not rear. It held level. Roots and packed soil gave way beneath the prongs, and the hull stayed low, the device pulling the green wall apart as the tank rolled through. Men who had hugged ditches watched from the mud and felt a tremor of disbelief and relief. Word travels fast where lives are at stake, and mechanics in other units began to copy the concept in their own workshops, each iteration carrying the fingerprints of those who had hammered and cut and cursed in the dark. Some crews shortened the prongs, others bolted diagonal plates to shear stubborn roots, and one unit added a mesh guard to keep flying splinters from the driver. Reports seeped up the chain that fewer tanks were burning on the far side of hedgerows, and that infantry were losing fewer men to sudden machine gun ambushes, when armour could stay level and provide suppressive fire. At first, the reaction at battalion headquarters was forms and threats and the language of regulation. Improvised modification and the removal of captured enemy property do not sit well on paperwork. Practicality, however, is persuasive when it is measured in lives saved and equipment returned to company tables. Commanders softened as the numbers on casualty sheets stopped climbing at the same rate, and the fork moved from a criminal act to a field expedient recorded with reluctant approval. The fork did not end the fighting, nor did it make the bocage kind, though change the tempo of small engagements. Fields that once took hours and cost dozens of men could be opened more quickly, and the margin between victory and ruin narrowed. The men who built it were not given banners or medals for that night work. Their triumph lived in after-action reports and in letters that sketched crude diagrams to wives and fathers. There was a moral ambiguity to their act. They had stolen and improvised, and in doing so risked court-martial. Yet they had also saved comrades who might have bled out in the mud. When officers finally inspected the modification in daylight, there was a tension between regulations and results, between the neat language of command and the messy calculus of survival. The reports were filed, signatures hurried, and the device passed into service notes with a grudging nod. In the weeks that followed, the fork spread along the front like a practical rumour. It was copied and adapted and sometimes improved, and the bocage kept taking its due, but at least one new tool made the meat. Grinder a little less efficient. Cullen and Roberts and the welders went back to their tanks and to their duties, each carrying a small private knowledge that they had changed something in the fight. Their act remained illegal in the books, but in the mud and blood of Normandy the fork became, to many, simply common sense. Decades later, veterans would argue about the propriety of their theft and jury rigging, but when old men sat around tables and passed photographs and told the stories, they usually shrugged and said that in a war of machines and men, sometimes laws had to be bent for the sake of brothers elsewhere. July 14th, 1944. Morning. The sun barely lifts above the horizon when word begins to spread like wildfire through the ranks of the American division bivouacked in the Norman countryside. By dawn, soldiers from half the division are whispering about the insane tanker who welded scrap metal to his Sherman tank. Some call it genius, most call it madness. Among them, disbelief mixes with curiosity, because every man knows how deadly the French hedgerows have been. Every assault against those earthen walls has cost blood. Every hill gained has come at a price measured in friends buried in shallow graves. Lieutenant Colonel James Bates, the hard-faced battalion commander, does not rely on rumours. He arrives in person, boots caked with mud, eyes sharp as bayonets. The men part for him like a tide. His presence commands silence. Standing before him is Sergeant Curtis Coolin, grease on his hands, standing next to the modified Sherman that gleams under the weak sun. The tank looks grotesque, its front end fitted with jagged steel prongs that jut forward like the teeth of some iron beast. "Sergeant Coolin," Bates growls, circling the machine. "What in God's name is that?" Coolin straightens. "A hedgerow cutter, sir. Did you get authorization for this modification?" "No, sir." "Did you requisition that steel through proper channels?" "No, sir." Bates narrows his eyes. "So you stole enemy material, altered government property without permission, and now you're standing here expecting me not to throw you in the stockade?" Cullen meets the colonel's gaze, steady, defiant but respectful. "Sir, I'm expecting you to let me prove it works." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words hang in the air. Around them, dozens of soldiers stand motionless, breath held, aware that what happens next could mean the difference between life and death for all of them. Bates studies Coolin for a long moment. His silence stretches, heavy as the morning fog. Finally, he speaks, voice low. "And if it doesn't work?" Cullen swallows, but doesn't look away. "Then you can court-martial me, sir. But if it does work?" Earthen fortresses that have swallowed men whole. How many lives could we save? Bates looks toward the walls of green and earth that have become the army's greatest enemy since landing in Normandy. The colonel's jaw tightens. Then, with a curt nod, he gives the verdict. "You get one test. One. If that thing fails, or gets your crew killed, you're done. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Then show me." The test hedgerow stands 80 yards away, 12 feet high, layered with dirt, stone, and tangled roots, topped with hawthorn and oak that have stood for centuries. To the untrained eye, it looks like an overgrown mound. To every man here, it's a wall of death that has stopped tanks and swallowed entire platoons. Cullen climbs into his Sherman. The familiar metal smell fills the cramped space. His crew, Roberts, Taylor, and Finch, say nothing. Fear clings to them like sweat. Roberts, his gunner and closest friend, gives a shaky thumbs up. Cullen answers with a nod. The engine roars to life, coughing smoke. The tank vibrates under them like a beast straining to run. Cullen's hands grip the controls. His voice, barely audible, mutters, "Here we go. 5 miles per hour. The hedgerow looms closer. 10. The earth trembles beneath 30 tons of steel. 15. Then impact. Instead of climbing and exposing its belly, The Sherman slams straight into the hedgerow. The steel prongs bite into the earth like fangs tearing into flesh. The tank doesn't rise, it digs. The front anchors, the treads churn, and the engine howls in agony as the machine rips forward. Dirt explodes. Roots snap like gunfire. The ground shudders as centuries of growth surrender to brute force. Then, with a thunderous crack, the Sherman bursts through. 90 seconds after the first hit, the tank breaks free on the far side of the hedgerow, its hull covered in mud and leaves, its steel prongs dripping with shredded roots and pulverized rock. Behind it, the wall of earth now bears a gaping wound, an 8-foot-wide opening, clear and solid enough for infantry and tanks alike to pass through. Inside the tank, the crew stares in disbelief. Then laughter erupts, raw and joyous, echoing through the intercom. "It worked!" Roberts shouts, pounding the side of the turret. "It damn well worked!" Across the field, Lieutenant Colonel Bates stands motionless. The impossible has unfolded before his eyes. Slowly, he exhales, his stern composure melting into astonishment. Then he spins on his heel and runs toward the command tent. "Get me General Bradley," he barks at the radio man. "Right now. Tell him we have something he needs to see." 2 hours later, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st United States Army, arrives in a mud-splattered jeep. His face is drawn with exhaustion, his uniform marked with the dust of weeks spent in the field. But his eyes are alert. The soldiers snap to attention as he steps out. In the distance, Cullen's Sherman is already lining up for another run. The general watches silently, hands behind his back. The tank charges again, 5 miles per hour, then 10, then 15, and once more, the hedgerow falls before it like paper before a blade. 90 seconds, every single time. No exposed underbelly. No vulnerable pause. Just relentless momentum. The tank becomes an unstoppable force, turning deadly hedgerows into shattered gateways. Bradley watches 3 full demonstrations, each identical, each flawless. His officers exchange stunned glances. This crude invention, born not from orders or research, but from desperation and ingenuity, has solved a problem that planners and engineers couldn't. Finally, Bradley turns to the young sergeant standing by his mud-covered tank. His voice is calm but carries the weight of command. "Sergeant, what's your name?" "Curtis G. Cullen III, sir." Bradley nods. "Where'd you get the steel?" "From the beaches, sir." "Check. Hedgehogs. The obstacles the Germans left behind." "And the design?" Cullen glances toward his crew. "Corporal Roberts had the idea, sir. I just welded it." For a long moment, Bradley says nothing. The wind carries the distant sound of artillery from beyond the hedgerows. Then, unexpectedly, the general smiles the first smile his men have seen in weeks. "Sergeant," he says quietly, "you just changed this war." By the next morning, orders spread across the entire First Army. Every available welder, every scrap of steel from the beaches, is to be gathered. Within days, hundreds of tanks begin sprouting the strange metal teeth. They call them rhino tanks. Soon, across Normandy, the thunder of engines fills the countryside as Shermans rip through hedgerows in minutes, leading infantry through gaps that once demanded blood. What once took hours of dangerous work now takes a minute and a half, 90 seconds, that turn stalemate into breakthrough. Cullen's small act of rebellion becomes legend. Soldiers who once mocked his madness now salute him. Commanders who doubted him now rely on his invention to push the front lines forward. But Cullen doesn't bask in glory. To him, it isn't heroism, it's survival. It's the sound of a tank tearing through the walls that killed too many brothers. It's the roar of engines, the smell of dirt, the cries of men finally moving forward instead of dying in place. As the days pass, the hedgerows of Normandy, once nature's fortress, become the Allies' highway. Villages, once unreachable, fall one by one. The road to Saint-Lô opens. The path to liberation begins. And somewhere, standing beside his battered Sherman, Sergeant Curtis Cullen wipes the sweat from his brow, unaware that his improvised invention will be remembered for generations. For in a war defined by strategy, technology, and overwhelming numbers, it was sometimes a simple act of defiance, a stolen piece of steel, a spark of courage, and 90 seconds of faith that changed the course of history. July 15th, 1944. The news spreads through the camps before the morning coffee is even poured. Within 24 hours of witnessing Sergeant Curtis Cullen's invention in action, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley issues the order that will ripple across Europe like thunder. His message is clear and urgent. Manufacture Cullen's device in quantity, use every available Czech hedgehog from the beaches, and weld them to every Sherman tank in the European theatre of operations. No committee, no hesitation, just execution. The improvised contraption quickly gains multiple names. Some call it the Cullen Rhino device, others the Cullen hedgerow cutter, while a few simply refer to it as the prongs. Whatever the term, it becomes a symbol of raw American ingenuity. Steel teeth forged from enemy scrap, born out of desperation, now transformed into an army-wide solution. Across Normandy, fabrication shops ignite with sparks and the hum of welding torches. This time, the work is done by trained welders, not liquor salesmen with field blowtorches. They work day and night, sweating over the steel under canvas tents and makeshift workshops. The air smells of hot metal, oil, and purpose. Tank crews wait impatiently, watching as their Shermans are fitted with the strange new attachments. Soldiers who once mocked Cullen's madness now pray for their tanks to receive the Rhino before the next battle. By July 25th, when Operation Cobra is set to begin, nearly 3/4 of the 2nd Armoured Division's tanks are equipped with the device. The transformation is astonishing, fields of steel beasts now bristling with sharp, angled prongs that look both absurd and terrifying. What began as one man's illegal modification has become an official army upgrade. The German defensive strategy in Normandy has been simple but brutally effective. Hold the hedgerows, force the Americans to grind forward inch by inch, bleed them in every field, and make them pay in lives for every 100 yards. For weeks, it has worked perfectly. The hedgerows, those ancient earthen walls lined with thick roots and dense greenery, have become the Germans' fortress. Allied tanks stall against them, exposed to enemy fire from camouflaged positions, unable to maneuver or retaliate effectively. But on July 25th, 1944, that changes. When Operation Cobra begins, the Shermans no longer stop at the hedgerows. They punch straight through them, 90 seconds per wall. That's all it takes. One after another, tanks roar forward, their new steel teeth biting into the earth, ripping centuries of growth apart like paper. Dirt and roots fly. Field after field falls open. German machine gun nests that once commanded perfect kill zones suddenly lose their advantage as tanks burst through where no road or gap existed before. The Germans are stunned. Their carefully planned strong points, those interlocking fields of fire that had slaughtered American infantry for weeks, are now useless. The Shermans with rhino prongs don't use the roads anymore. They don't funnel into predictable choke points. They don't play by the rules of the battlefield the Germans built. They go anywhere, everywhere. The effect is immediate and devastating. Entire defensive lines collapse as American armor appears in places once thought inaccessible. The German commanders, trained to predict movement and set traps, find their maps meaningless. War correspondent Chester Wilmot captures it perfectly when he writes, "The Rhino tanks restored mobility to the Allied force. The Germans could no longer predict where the next breakthrough would occur." Operation Cobra becomes the turning point. In just 6 days, the American advance tears open the German front. The breakout from the Normandy bocage transforms from a slow, grinding struggle into a thunderous charge. Tanks and infantry move with new speed, pushing through countryside that once seemed impossible to cross. Roads that had been impassable now echo with engines. Columns of armour stream through breaches that would have taken hours of bloody fighting only days before. The Allied momentum accelerates from a cautious crawl to a ferocious sprint, and behind it all, unseen amid the chaos and triumph, stands the ghost of one man's defiance. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III, a liquor salesman from New Jersey who, a month earlier, had stolen German steel from a beach, welded it to a tank, and changed the war. As the summer wanes and the fields of France fill with the dust of liberation, Culin's invention spreads far beyond his division. Within weeks, thousands of tanks across Europe bear the same steel tusks. They cut through Normandy, through Brittany, and into the heart of France. The once endless hedgerows, which had claimed so many lives, become nothing more than shattered mounds under the tracks of the Allied advance. American soldiers give the Rhino tanks nicknames Culin's Beasts, the Hedgehogs, and sometimes just Freedom Cutters. For every field crossed, every ambush avoided, every life spared, they whisper silent thanks to the sergeant who dared to break the rules. But wars do not pause for heroes. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied armies push toward Germany itself. The battles grow fiercer, the weather colder, the terrain darker. The next great test comes in the haunted woods of the Hürtgen forest, a nightmare of mud, rain and mines. It is November 20th, 1944. The air smells of pine and death. Sergeant Curtis Culin, still serving despite months of exhaustion, leads his men through a patch of forest thick with mist. He steps forward, eyes scanning for tripwires. The explosion comes without warning. The landmine erupts beneath him. The blast hurls him backward, tearing through his left leg below the thigh and mangling what remains. His men rush to him, their shouts muffled by ringing ears. Blood stains the frozen ground. The medics arrive within minutes, their hands shaking as they work to stop the bleeding. They save his life, but the cost is steep. When Culin wakes days later in a field hospital, the world feels far away. His leg is gone. The pain is immense, but deeper still is the hollow ache of knowing his war is over. The surgeons tell him he'll go home soon. He nods, silent, staring at the ceiling. The news of his injury spreads quickly. In the command tents, officers speak his name with reverence. In the tank battalions, men whisper stories about him, the sergeant who broke the rules to save lives. Letters pour in from fellow soldiers, engineers, and even generals. Some call him a genius, others a hero. But Culin himself never claims either title. When interviewed later, he simply says, "We just wanted to get through the hedgerows alive." Before the year ends, Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III receives the Legion of Merit and the Purple Heart. The medals are pinned to his uniform in a quiet ceremony, far from the roar of engines and the smell of oil that once defined his days. He doesn't stand for the occasion, he can't, but when the general salutes him, he salutes back, steady and proud. He returns home to New Jersey, limping on crutches, carrying the scars of both pain and triumph. To the men still fighting in Europe, his invention remains a symbol of what the American spirit can do when necessity meets imagination. Historians will later write that Operation Cobra marked the true beginning of the Allied breakout the moment the war in Western Europe shifted irrevocably in favour of the Allies. But those who lived it will always remember something simpler. A handful of soldiers, a stolen truckload of steel, and a sergeant who refused to wait for permission to save lives. Because sometimes history turns not on grand strategies or orders from high command, but on a single act of courage under fire. And in July of 1944, that act took 90 seconds. By November, it had changed the world. Cranford, New Jersey, 1963. Curtis Culin, known simply as Curtis to his friends. Never Culin, never the Rhino guy, dies quietly in Greenwich Village on November 20th, 19 years to the day after the landmine took his leg. The coincidence is not lost on those who knew him, though Curtis himself never spoke of such things. He was 48 years old when he passed, a man who had lived two lives, the first ending in the mud of France, the second beginning in the recovery wards where he learned to walk again. He married after the war, a quiet ceremony with a woman who understood that some stories stay buried in a man's chest. He went back to selling liquor, travelling routes through New Jersey, with a slight limp and a disposition that never quite matched the weight of what he carried. He lived what most would call a normal life, the kind built on routine and small pleasures. But normalcy, for Curtis, was a costume he wore over an abnormal past. A past measured in steel and fire. A past that changed the course of a war but rarely made it into conversation. He never talked much about France. Most heroes do not. They carry their wars in silence, stored away like old photographs too painful to look at in daylight. They bury him in Fairview Cemetery in Westfield, New Jersey, on a cold autumn day when the leaves have already fallen and the ground is hard. The funeral is small. The attendees are mostly family, a few war buddies who made the trip, some neighbours who knew him as the liquor salesman with the kind smile. There are no reporters, no newsreels, no grand ceremony befitting the man who invented a solution that saved thousands of lives. Curtis would have wanted it that way. In death, as in life, he preferred to remain unremarkable. Years later, his hometown of Cranford erects a small memorial. It is modest, understated, much like Curtis himself. A piece of steel, shaped like the prongs he welded that July night in France. The prongs that tore through hedgerows and broke the stalemate in Normandy. The metal is painted black, weathered by time and the elements. A bronze plaque sits below it, engraved with simple words. Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen III. The Rhino Tank. Innovation under fire. 1944. Tourists do not notice it much. They pass by on their way to diners and antique shops, glancing at it the way one glances at any roadside marker, acknowledged but not absorbed. Local kids use it as a meeting spot, leaning against the steel with skateboards and backpacks, unaware that the shape they rest against is a replica of something that once punched through walls of earth and wood under machine gun fire. Nobody remembers the night Curtis stole German steel from a destroyed roadblock, his hands covered in grease and adrenaline. Nobody remembers the illegal welding sessions conducted in the dark, sparks flying while officers turned blind eyes. Nobody remembers the 90 seconds it took for his invention to prove itself, 90 seconds that separated failure from breakthrough, death from survival. But on the anniversary of D-Day, a few veterans still visit. They come slowly now, some in wheelchairs, others with canes, all of them bent by time, but still standing. They touch the steel with hands that once gripped gun barrels and steering wheels. They remember the hedgerows, those ancient walls of earth and root that turned France into a killing ground. They remember the boys who died before Cullen's invention, trapped in their tanks as German fire rained down. And they remember the boys who lived because of it, who broke through those walls and kept moving forward when forward seemed impossible. One veteran, an old tanker with a wooden cane and eyes that still see 1944, runs his fingers along the memorial's edge. His grandson stands beside him, 17 years old and bored, checking his phone with the impatience of youth. The old man does not rush. He traces the steel slowly, reverently, as if reading Braille written in metal. They said it was illegal, he murmurs, more to himself than to the boy. Said he could have been court-martialed for what he did, stealing that steel, modifying military equipment without authorization. His grandson, barely listening, glances up from the glowing screen. So why was he not? He asks, the question casual, almost dismissive. The old tanker smiles, a thin smile that carries decades of knowing. Because sometimes the best ideas do not wait for permission, kid. Sometimes you just have to weld something together in the dark and pray it works when the sun comes up. He looks at the steel prongs, rusted now in places, decorative, harmless, a monument to violence that no longer threatens. "90 seconds, he says softly. That is all it took to punch through a wall. And once you punch through the first wall, kid, the rest of them start falling too. The grandson does not understand. Not really. He nods politely, the way young people do when old people talk about wars they have only seen in movies. He was not there. He cannot know what it means to be trapped, to be desperate, to watch men die for lack of a solution that seems obvious only in hindsight. But somewhere in France, on overgrown fields that used to run red with American and German blood, the hedgerows still stand. Ancient, impassive, silent, they have outlasted the armies that fought beneath them. They have outlasted Curtis Culin. They will outlast everyone who remembers. And if you listen closely on summer nights, when the wind blows just right through the Norman countryside, you can almost hear it. The roar of a Sherman engine, the shriek of steel biting in earth, the sound of ordinary men doing extraordinary things because extraordinary things were required. 90 seconds. That is all it takes to change the world, if you are willing to break the rules to save it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.